I'm a retired local journalist. I worked for the Orange County Register as an editor for 33 years. I also worked as a reporter in Southern California and in Nevada for 3 years at the beginning of my career, and as an editor in Nevada for a couple of years. So for a total of 42 years in journalism in Southern California and in Nevada.
So you worked mostly in local news. So why did you decide to stay in local news over the course of your career?
It was partly because of the newspapers I worked for. The Orange County Register, which I worked for the longest, was focused on covering the entire county. So while it was local, it wasn't local in the sense of only covering one city. They covered the entire county, which is 34, I think, cities now, and plus county government and some statewide reporting too. So, and also then for personal reasons, I have a son who has some major medical problems. I wasn't in a position to be able to pursue any jobs with national newspapers.
So, well, you worked in a lot of local news, and I know in journalism during its prime, local news just was set to preserve truth and gave local citizens a steady and accurate source of information. During the course of your career, what have you seen change that caused a shift from local news to diminish?
Starting in the mid to late 1990s, local newspapers started to diminish. This accelerated quite a lot in the period between 2000 and say 2010. It became extremely noticeable. Local newspapers died out or were bought up or were consolidated in a very large degree. And a part of this was due to the proliferation of people deciding that they didn't really want to read newspapers anymore. It was a technological revolution with online coverage, and newspapers owners and top editors, not, in my opinion, not really understanding that this was a very seismic shift and a generational shift, and that they really should have understood it better and gone along with it better. I eventually became a digital editor for the newspapers that I worked for. And they didn't particularly understand that whole societal and cultural and generational shift. And I'm sorry, what was the lost my train of thought? It's a big question. Yeah. It's a political analysis, and it's a societal analysis. I think that because news outlets have consolidated, because there are so many fewer local news outlets now because of how things have changed over the past 20 or 30 years, it's a lot harder to get local news. I'll give you an example. I worked for the Orange County Register for 33 years. At its peak in the early to mid 1990s, there were over 500 editors and reporters in the newsroom. And that's not the people who wrote opinion pieces. Those are people who covered the news, who were reporters, editors, photographers, graphics artists doing charts and graphs and illustrations, people who put together the pages of the newspaper. Later on, people who put together what were then the very, very early website pages. And there was over 500 people. Today, there are fewer than 50. When I left the paper in 2014, there were about 230. So there has been a huge diminishment of people who can cover local issues and local news.
For local news specifically, I know that I was actually trying to do research last week or so about, or 2 weeks ago, about different local events. How would, if people can't find local news very easily, what would the next best thing be?
You mean if they can't find it on a local news site?
Yeah.
There probably are community forums that they could look for, depending on exactly what they're looking for. If they know what the type of event that they're looking for, they can go directly to that group and their website, or Google some keywords that are related to what they're looking for and see what pops up. But you also then have to know how to make sure that what you found is a reliable source of information. So if you're looking to find information about how to vote, for example, and where to find your voting polling place because you know that there's a local election coming up, a lot of information is going to pop up. So are you looking at the County Registrar of Voters website? Are you looking at the League of Women Voters website? Do you know which groups are legitimate and which might be people who are just putting out disinformation?
Speaking, I guess, on the topic of disinformation and misinformation in the age of digital news, it's very easy to spread all the information. Why has like misinformation become so rampant to the point where either you can't trust it or you've already trusted it too much?
I think that you have people who are, what's known as bad actors, people who deliberately spread misinformation or disinformation for one reason or another. These people have always been there. There have always been, propagandists, people who, for one reason or another, sometimes it's for political aims, sometimes it's for their own aims, sometimes it's a money-making scheme or whatever. So there've always been bad actors who just want to, who are stirring up trouble for one reason or another. It is a lot easier to do that digitally than it used to be before the digital age, because anybody can hop online, create a website, and start stirring up trouble. In terms of fake news, sometimes it's inadvertent. Sometimes someone can be looking for something and think they found something interesting, and it's not exactly right. It's just a little off, but then they might put it on their Facebook page, and their friends think, oh, that's really interesting, and they pick it up and they post it, and stuff gets reposted or whatever, and it's interesting. A good example of those are kind of the apocryphal, heartwarming type of stories about how somebody helped somebody else or saved somebody else or something. And if you read them, you'll think, this probably couldn't really have happened, could it? So if you look into it and research it, you're going to find out that it's either entirely not true, or parts of it aren't true, or it's been exaggerated. And it's not, malicious or anything. It's just, people like to believe that because it makes people feel good. It's heartwarming. And it's easier to spread that too in the digital age, because essentially everybody is a publisher. Everybody has access to a way to put out information. And before the digital age, it was much harder for anyone to be a publisher.
Also, I guess more on the digital age, I know that before digital media, there's kind of like this precedent to make sure that all the news that's being sent out, especially with bigger media companies, were accurate information and was fact checked. But why has that kind of changed? Why has that kind of like changed in recent years?
Well, news organizations still do fact checking. And so, a newspaper's website and printed editions and a news magazine like, Time Magazine or something like that, they still do that. But there are so many other people. Like I said, this has basically turned anyone into a publisher. I can create a website and start putting stuff on it. So can you. So there are people who are doing self-promotion, and there are people who are, in politics, everything is self-promotion, right? So if you're a politician, you're going to try to make yourself look as good as possible. This includes ignoring some of the things that you might not necessarily want everybody to know about. You're going to ignore some of the little character flaws you might have, or some of the little things that might not make you look quite as good, that if I were a reporter coming along reporting about you, I would include those things if I wrote about you, because it would simply be the entire truth, as near as I could determine it. Everybody can't always, there's no such thing as being always able to determine the entire truth about something. That's kind of too pure of a concept. It's just not always possible. But people like to, just like if you're going someplace, you like to look as good as possible. So do I. So I put on makeup because it makes me look maybe a year younger. It's that kind of concept. We try to present ourselves in the best light possible.
And because why do a lot of people, I guess specifically older people, believe these types of information rather than actually try to go find the information for themselves?
Some of that is a question of digital skill. I'm in my 60s, so there are a number of people my age who don't have, we didn't grow up with this. This is something that's happened within our adult lifetimes, long after we were out of college. We don't have digital information hunting skills like younger people. So it's definitely something you have to learn. But people, anyone, if you've ever, I was a political science major in college, and the reason political propaganda works is because people like to believe information that coincides with beliefs they already have, and that makes them feel good, and that makes them feel good about themselves. So if you present what is supposed to be information that coincides with people's beliefs, they're going to more readily accept it.
Is that kind of what happened, I guess, with information regarding the COVID-19 pandemic? Because there was a lot of fake news being spread around that kind of contradicted scientific claims.
Part of the problem with the initial, and I think part of the problem with the initial COVID-19 pandemic was that the information about it in the very early stages changed very rapidly. And that kind of rapidly changing information is hard for people to keep up with and to process. And that's just human nature. People tend to want, particularly in a new and uncertain and frightening situation, people tend to want reassurance and they want definitive information. So if you know that people are getting this terrible illness that is killing people, you want to know, how do I keep myself safe? How do I keep my family safe? And you want definitive information about how do you do that. And if the information about that changes from day to day, which is not the fault of the medical personnel telling you that, it's just that they keep getting new information about it, it tends to, there are people who find that upsetting because they find that difficult to deal with. For a lot of people, change is hard to deal with. And changing information, constantly changing information, is hard to deal with. So I think that was probably a large part of it. I think, I wouldn't swear to it, but I think I've seen Dr. Anthony Fauci, try to address part of this as pointing out that information that they were learning as they went along about the virus. And the virus itself keeps changing. It keeps developing new variants. We have a Delta variant that 6 months ago we didn't have.
I guess also there are a lot of people who, after this changing, still wouldn't want, I guess, that don't keep up with COVID and the scientific facts behind it because for some various reasons, which have led to a lot of people who are anti-vax, like anti-vaccine, vax, anti-vaxxers. What would like the best course of action to make sure that these people know that the vaccine is safe and it's not actually going to harm them?
I think that you can present information to people and try to present it in a calm, reassuring manner. There were anti-vaxxers before COVID because there were always anti-vaxxers who, for example, didn't want their children to have the routine childhood vaccinations that schools require. So there's always been that segment of the population. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I know the answer. I mean, I think the answer from a journalism standpoint is that you just keep presenting the information and you keep presenting the data and the statistics, and you present it in a factual, emotionally neutral manner, and you just keep presenting it. You can only do so much about people who refuse to believe factual information.
And I know that I guess a lot of journalists get a lot of heat for being really biased, especially in this day and age. Where would you recommend people go to gain, I guess, factual, like the least biased information, or whether or not they should just read both sides?
Well, everybody has biases. I mean, I do, you do, everybody does. People read the news through the lenses of their own biases. So a really common experience that I had throughout my 4 decades in journalism, and that every other journalist I know does too, is that you could post a story or publish a story, and you would immediately have several online comments about it saying, well, this isn't true because I believe X. And then you would have people from the other side of the issue say, well, this isn't true because I believe Y. And I always figured I'd done my job right if I had about an equal number of people from each side saying they didn't believe it for opposite reasons, right? Because then it was balanced out. So there are always people who are going to say that they don't believe something. The latest way of saying you don't believe something or that you disagree with something is to call it fake news, which is just the latest buzzword for that. But people always have perceived news and information through the lens of their own set of beliefs and their own assumptions and their own biases. That's always been true. It's become more contentious within the past, I think, 5 or 6 years. And I think that there are reasons for that. I think that, that has to do with people in the public sphere promoting the idea that you can be more contentious about it. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, it just wasn't considered a polite thing to do, so people didn't do it as much. But the way that I think your question was, how do you try not to do?
I think it was like, where would you recommend people go to get more accurate information?
Depending on the subject, I would try to find several of the best and most well-researched online sources of information. So let's say the subject is the COVID-19 vaccination safe? So you could look at National Institutes of Health. You could look at some of the leading hospital researchers in the country, Johns Hopkins, for example, and start looking at that kind of thing and see what well-regarded national medical institutions say about it, and then see who it is who's saying that it isn't safe, and see what those people's credentials are, and try to figure out why they would say it isn't safe. And the same thing with people who say it is safe. What are their credentials? Why would they say that?
There are a lot of people, I guess, who wouldn't have the time to be able to do this much research, and that's like one of the biggest problems with the spread of fake news. So, would it be, let's say, just political news in general? Would it be easier just to maybe spend 10 or 15 minutes to read, like maybe an article from CNN, an article from Fox News, or maybe
then that's why you decide which news sources do you trust, because what I was describing is basically what a reporter would do, look at the various sources and try to weed them out. So the reporter's doing that work for the public, because that's a reporter's and an editor's job. So then it becomes, which news sources do you consider the most reliable and the most trustworthy? And generally speaking, the main traditional news sources tend to be the most reliable and trustworthy, like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now, you're going to get people telling you that for political reasons they don't trust them. And so because of their political allegiances, they would have other ones that they would trust. I would say, it depends on how much time you want to spend researching it. So how many news sources can you read, and how much time do you want to spend reading it? The more fringe the news sources are, the less reliable. So things like OAN and some of the other less reliable news sources tend to be more biased in their presentation. Breitbart, for example, which isn't even a news source, really. It's an opinion website.
And I guess, is there like a major correlation between the spread of fake news and digital news?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Because before you had digital news, before the late 1990s, early 2000s, if you wanted to get news and information, you either watched TV news or you went out and bought a print newspaper or a print news magazine like Time or Newsweek. And you could only find so many of those. I used to like to read French newspapers, and I would have to go to a bookstore in South Coast Plaza called Rizzoli and buy week-old French newspapers there if I wanted to read them, or go to the UCI library and read them. So once the digital age happened, then all of a sudden I could read French newspapers online. I thought, well, this is great, and you could read any newspapers online, or you could pay a fee to read them online, depending on how, what they posted. So definitely the proliferation of fake news, which is another way of saying basically propaganda, or distorted news, definitely is linked to the rise in digital news. It was always there before, but you had to look more for it, and it also, I think, was more obvious what it was.
Is there also a link between the politicization of, or more politicization of news and fake news? Or are they separate?
Well, I don't think that you can call traditional news media more politicized now than it used to be. For example, newspapers like the LA Times, the Orange County Register, let's say the San Francisco Chronicle, any traditional medium-sized to large, even small city newspaper I don't think is more politicized now than it was 30 years ago. And in some ways might even be less because it's easier to get information now because of the digital age. So what there is a lot more of is a lot more disinformation, which is the same thing. Disinformation, fake news, and propaganda to me is all in the same bucket. It's all basically the same way of saying the same thing. So there's a lot more of that because for people who want to write and put out disinformation, propaganda, and fake news, it is much easier to do it. All you have to do is build a website and start publishing it online and then get people to look at it. That's not that hard. I can do that in an afternoon. Anybody can. Whereas before there was the digital era, you had to somehow find a way to print it and distribute it and get people to buy it or look at it or buy advertising in it to subsidize you or have somebody with enough money to subsidize it.
Would, I guess, the spread of propaganda also be linked to social media companies such as Facebook or Twitter as like a super spreader?
Yes, yes, definitely. And that's one of the things that people complain a lot about, particularly about Facebook, that there don't seem to be any safeguards or any breaks with Facebook. That, obviously anybody can, it seems like anybody can post anything they want. That's not exactly true. There are standards, but the people can post an awful lot of misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms, and they do constantly. And so that, yes, that helps with the proliferation of it. And then it just becomes confusing. If you're the average person who doesn't have a media background or a political science background or a social sciences background, and you're sitting there trying to sort it all out, it can just seem, I'm sure, overwhelming. I know people who say to me, they've given up on Facebook. They don't want to look at social media. They don't want to read it because how do they sort it out, And I tell them, well, just, go onto Facebook so you can chat with your relatives and leave it at that.
So I guess one of my final questions would be many people who fall, many people who read a lot of fake news or are trying to avoid it. What advice would you give people who often hear fake news and are trying to get out of a fake news cycle and get more accurate information?
Google is your friend. I'll give an example. A good friend of mine posted a link to somebody else's post, for example, somebody that I didn't know. And it was this really heartwarming story about something. And I was reading it and I was thinking, I'm always skeptical because I'm a former journalist, but I thought this sounds just a little too good to be true. And so I just copied a couple of lines of it and pasted it into a Google search. And sure enough, it popped up with a Snopes.com article and a factcheck.org article saying, well, this is all it's a sweet story, but it's not true. So those are two fact-checking organizations that had checked this out a couple of years ago. And these feel-good stories that are too good to be true, or these really apocryphal stories about something horrible that's happened and that, somebody saved somebody else or rescued somebody else or something terrible happened. These things tend to get recycled, changed maybe a little bit every time, but recycled every few years. So if something sounds too good to be true, or just sounds a little bit too much like a movie plot or a fairy tale, or something just seems a little bit too much like a novel about it, I usually think, well, that just sounds kind of odd, and I paste a few lines or a paragraph into Google, and most of the time it'll pop up, and it will already have been run through one of those fact-checking sites, and they'll show it not to be true. And, then I told my friend very nicely, this is a sweet story, and it's very heartwarming, but unfortunately it's not true.
I guess like in the reverse, when people are reading information that isn't maybe like not as heartwarming and more political, that is also like disinformation, how that also would maybe align with their political beliefs. How would they, I guess, identify that would be fake news and then try to find the truth?
Well, that's harder, because if something aligns with someone's political beliefs, then they're invested in believing it, and they want to believe it, and they want to believe it because that's part of their identity, part of their political identity, and part of their sense of self, and part of their sense of how they relate to the world. So that's potentially a much harder conversation if you're trying to talk to them about it. If I'm trying to talk to somebody that I know I probably disagree with politically, or I know what they're putting up is not correct, in the first place, I know that they'll probably just say, well, that's a matter of opinion. It might be to some degree, but on the other hand, if I can objectively prove that it isn't, if I can say, well, that's not true, this law says this and does this, where, as you're saying, that none of this ever happened, that kind of thing, I think I would just very unemotionally and very factually say those things. Here's what this does and this does and this does, and that's not what your paragraph says, and just very politely leave it at that, so that it doesn't become an emotional argument, because people tend to be emotionally invested in that kind of thing, and it probably wouldn't help anyway. They would remain emotionally invested in it and probably wouldn't believe me, but if I were going to try that would be how I would approach it.